Go ahead and get started. Everybody, my name is Michelle Avalos. I am the Deputy Director at Impact Hub Houston, and I'm very excited that we're able to pull this event together because literally we have had a crazy week and things have just been moving so quickly and adapting, and it just felt right to be able to add one more opportunity for us to have this, what is called a community conversation about the situation that occurred last week. And I want to just give a warm welcome to my dear friend, my mentor, my former colleague, Lafayette Herring, who is here today with us. He's had over 20 years of experience in the industry. He was one of the first people that I worked with when I graduated from the University of Houston. And I really do consider you a mentor, Lafayette. So thank you for continuing to provide your time for us. Guys, I literally reached out to him last week in the midst of checking in with each other, seeing how things were, and this notion of wanting to bridge this information gap with everything that's going on in the power structure in our state to really understand what was behind all of these power outages that occurred last week. And we understand some of us in Houston are still going through, living the aftermaths of Winter Storm Uri. And this is just one opportunity for us to come together and really problem solve. So to give you guys a little bit more background as well, I actually used to work in the energy industry for about 5 years as an analyst. And when everything started happening last week, I already knew how complicated things are. People were going to have this bridge to have to cross over to really understand what was going on, because I went through that myself when I was going through the industry. And I wanted to be able to provide that opportunity to anybody to be able to really understand that process of our power market, how it works, how it compares to the rest of the United States, and really what were those pieces behind what ultimately led to the power outages. So if you haven't had an opportunity, we actually put together a blog post that we have on the Impact Hub Houston website. I'll drop it into the chat in case you have not seen that yet. And at the risk of just repeating everything on the blog, what we're going to do is starting off with just a quick recap and a brief overview of what are some of the elements that were discussed there so that we can be on the same page for the conversation. And then we'll dig into hearing a little bit more commentary from Lafayette, some based on your experience and everything that you know, what would you add to that conversation? We'll touch on some of the questions that were submitted and even think through a little bit of what are some of the bottlenecks that there are currently in the system, and then what are those opportunities for us to problem solve to prevent something like this from occurring again in our state. So with that as a recap, our United States, it's broken up into 3 primary power market transition grids. It's the Western grid, the Western interconnection, the Eastern interconnection, and then our Texas interconnection. And the super important things you need to know about our Texas interconnection is that it has minimal transmission interconnection to the other grids in the United States, and that our power grid is largely deregulated, which really just means that there's not one entity that holds the monopoly on the sale of electricity, and that we as the consumers get to choose our electricity provider. And our market in Texas is run by the name and everybody's Twitter feed, Facebook feed, Instagram feed. It's run by ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, who is an independent system operator. And their role is really to balance that supply and demand of power for all of the areas of Texas that are inside of the ERCOT operations. And they do this by estimating the short and the long-term power needs of the customer so that they're able to then communicate with the power plants who are submitting to them their availability, their capacity to generate, price points at which that they can generate. And then based on that demand that they're seeing, they start dispatching that supply that is available to actually generate our power. And if you guys look at the blog post that we shared, we included a couple of maps where you can see that in more detail. We've included a flow of how that electricity under the ERCOT structure actually flows through from the fuel source to the power generator facility to the electric retailers and the transmission grid. Or in Houston, we all know center point is that distribution and transmission utility, and then ultimately gets to us. But if we get back to what happened last week with Winter Storm Uri and how did the storm shock our ERCOT power grid, and as we've set these bullet points for you, but really it starts off with the fact that our Texas grid is set up currently to support these peaks in demand, mainly in the summer months, because hello, Texas is so hot, and you guys know that living here. But they don't have similar reliability measures in place for the winter months, despite incidents that have occurred in the past where you've seen that peak demand in the winter months. And so before the storm hit in, or as the storm was creeping into our state, what we saw was there were peaks in electricity demand because people started turning on their heaters at home, basically. They wanted to start staying warm. And so then that spike in the demand that occurred was also happening in tandem with scheduled planned plant outages that typically take place in the winter months, where the plants set up maintenance for the facilities or sometimes schedule even full shutdowns. And again, this is traditionally something that takes place during the winter months in Texas, because as I mentioned, that's when there's typically less demand for power in our state compared to the summer months. And so then as the plant operators were going through their scheduled planned outages, our electricity started to spike up, right? And so all ERCOT in the background was tracking all this information, and there's actually a lot more. You guys probably have seen this in the last 2 days. There was an emergency board meeting yesterday, and there's material now available for the general public to be able to see that and see what all occurred. And there's they've put together actually this really great map that's literally pinpointing from like the minutes to show you how demand grew and where the supply was at that given rate. So you guys can that's actually available to us. But the point where I was going to is whether or not, as ERCOT was saying, hey, we need more supply, whether or not those plants were actually able to get back online, it really depended on where they were in their planned outages. And then on top of all of that was the impacts of the actual winter weather and how it started to impact the infrastructure. So what happened then after that is that the supply ultimately, and if you go back to the blog, we talk a little bit more about the supply stack and how that's really set up, but it just became extra thin. ERCOT was not able to dispatch sufficient power from the generators to meet our electricity needs. And then what did you get? Millions of people were left without power for days. And although most of everyone's power is back in Texas, you guys know, especially in Houston, there's still millions of people that, as a side effect of all of this, are also without water access. And that's still happening today. Myself, my water got cut yesterday for most of the day again, and thankfully it got back today. But there's still so many in our city that are dealing with the aftermaths of everything that occurred. As the power generators working to get their facilities back online, then the storm passed through. So our demand for the heating also dropped. And as demand dropped, and then as some of the generators started coming back on, then eventually the power, and after like the forced power cuts and all of that occurred, eventually the supply and demand rebalanced in a way. So if the storm had started on longer, it might be a totally different story, and we'll get into that. But just framing that so that we can all kind of start from the same place. Lafayette, I'd love to hear some more feedback from you on how did you see things as they were developing, and just based on your experience, like what are some of the takeaways on your side that you feel like we should be paying more attention to as we have this conversation?
Well, Michelle, you've done a really good outline of kind of the physical situation of the Texas grid as it is, how the plants, there's physical power availability, and there just wasn't enough available. And one of the things that we've been doing for years is monitoring real time in the summer. You can open up the ERCOT website, and there's a map of Texas that is changing through the day by color. And as the day heats up in late July and August, you can see how we're tracking towards the limits of available power, and the colors change to show the impact in pricing. And we'll turn that on just to have it on for monitoring. It's not really a business thing for us. We're just watching it, and go to lunch and come back and the whole map is red. It shows that we're almost out of power in the middle of summer, and that's when every plant is available. So I wasn't really watching that map per se in the winter time, but when the announcement was that we were going to have this big storm and about 5 days out, and they became very concerned about the grid, I am familiar with the outages that they would, this time of year is when most of the plants are going through service, just as you described. And so not knowing how cold it was going to get, it was just kind of a wait and see what happens next. What really happened next was not even close. The Texas system was not even halfway at a point of making enough electricity to cover the requirement. Okay, the gap was enormously off, and so the only response that the op has is to literally cancel the demand. So they take it offline. So if a city, if they feel like they're run out, then they literally turn off parts of the city or areas in the grid, because if it goes out of balance, it would basically blow the fuse of the system, as it were. So they can only deliver what is available. If more is required and it's available, they have to cut it off. There's no other, otherwise they lose the system. And so I'd make a comment now that I was earlier in the day on a coffee break, I turned on the news, and on CNN, they were showing the hearing in Austin today. And some of the comments that were interesting is you might have heard the mention that ERCOT has later came out to say that they were 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes away from a system-wide shutdown. Well, I think a lot of people believe that when they were in the dark for 5 days, that is a system-wide shutdown.
Yeah.
You know, what does it mean when ERCOT is now saying we were 5 minutes from catastrophe? It looks like a catastrophe already. What they mean was they were 5 minutes away from losing the control ability to turn off things rapid fire in a way that didn't literally blow the system like a fuse. If that had occurred, so if we go back to Houston, downtown never lost power, and I believe that Midtown or the medical center never lost power. Not a lot of people live there, but that's an important thing. It's not important for business. It's important because if the system goes cold, then it's very difficult to bring it back online. So let me now try and describe what could have happened, and this is truly shocking. If the ERCOT system had come down completely, if it had failed system-wide, the analogy would be that you've got a whole neighborhood, city or whatever, that needs to start their cars, and there's only one battery. And your battery is sufficient to start your car, and then you could maybe jumpstart your neighbor's car, but the whole neighborhood can't plug in at one time. The battery's not strong enough. And the power system is not designed to start back up from a dead stop. So they would have to start at some system like South Texas, small, and piece by piece try and jumpstart the grid literally back like jump starting cars. And the estimate is it would take 6 to 8 weeks to bring electricity back to Texas.
Wow.
The entire system shut down.
Wow.
And that's hard to fathom because you wouldn't be able to pump gasoline. There would be no lights for anyone. There would be no communication. There would be no cell service. It would be truly the collapse that then waiting 6 weeks without TV and communication, you wouldn't know that we've lost the whole thing. We would all be in the dark entirely. So
the minutes from that.
It was less than 5 minutes from that. So I visualized these guys in a room with all the screens, and they were slamming the desk, turning off cities. You might have heard before the storm that they were planning rolling blackouts. And what they said is, we expect to have outages, but we will try and manage this on a systematic basis of rotating where those outages occur so that no one location goes down for a long period of time. what happened was it was much colder than they thought. Demand was much higher than they thought.
Yeah.
Then the plant started to freeze and they couldn't do the rolling. They shut off with no ability to bring back on. So a lot of people, I think, when their lights went out originally, thought, oh, we're now in the rolling blackout. It ought to be back on in a couple hours, maybe tomorrow.
Yeah.
And then 3 days later, hey, what about these rolling blackouts? The plan for rolling blackouts went out the window, I think, within the first hours of the storm. They realized they weren't even close to making things up. And so I wanted to mention that because it's part of the big news now coming out of the media and the politics and the pointing at ERCOT, that again, a lot of people said, well, from where I sit, I was 4 days in the dark and the cold. Seems like a system shut down to me. That's not what they're talking about. They were 4 minutes from a collapse, which would have been devastating to the Texas economy, to our health, to no telling what. It's hard to imagine what that could have been like. And let's just be honest, it's shameful that it got 4 minutes away from something that precarious.
And so understanding that too is so important, because like what you just said, a lot of folks moved on while there's still people dealing with these aftermaths. But as your brain kind of detaches, well, everything's back to normal now. First of all, it's not. But secondly, really understanding what happened and understanding like what didn't happen, what was that close to occurring, is important as we like move forward in this development of solutions. And actually a couple, Gilbert in the chat also commented saying thank you for the great insights, because people aren't really talking about that.
Right. And look, this is, again, the hearings are going on right now in Austin. Apparently, I wasn't even aware of that. It's not surprising. And there are many different venues of professionals that are hammering this out. This is obviously conversational and whatnot. But there was a second thing that I heard today in this just 5 minutes of watching CNN that I think is really important, that they had the CEO of ERCOT was in the chair getting grilled by the Texas legislators, and they said, what would you have done different? He said, I wouldn't have done anything different. And they sat back in their chairs and they said, what do you mean? And what that means to me is that he did the best he could with the tools and the resources and the market that he had available at the time. And ERCOT does not make the rules. ERCOT does not own any power plants. ERCOT doesn't have any money. They simply operate and try and work the system on a real-time basis day to day. And had the system failed, they would have been the operator behind the failed system, and maybe they would take blame for that. But in any case, if they had to turn people off, that is not the fault of ERCOT. That is the foundation for this failure is kind of a perfect storm. It's both the weather event, the timing of the year, that the planned outages, as Michelle was talking about, that many plants weren't available. So all these factors. But at the bottom of this is a point that Michelle's paper goes into a little bit, is what is the structure of the market in Texas, in ERCOT, that people invest in power plants? Why do we have the system that we have? How much power is there? Why is there not more power? The real short story, beyond the details in Michelle's paper, is that Texas operates on paying only for energy that is used. So in the big picture, no one is being paid anything for standby power. Therefore, no one is investing in standby power. We kind of had this system that operates real time, and people make their money back only when they're used. Well, if you don't have a guarantee of making your money back, then investors will not make that investment. And so that's a system issue. That's part of the rules of ERCOT, which is very different than the other grid systems, that they have a structure through their regulation and their energy policies, is that power generators get paid on the basis of having the plant available, and then when it's used, they get additional money for the energy that is served to the market. But at the same time, they get kind of this monthly low revenue rate, call it like a mortgage rate, that enables to make investments and they can go to the bank and get loans and all this stuff because there's kind of a guaranteed minimum payment available that's called a capacity payment. Texas ERCOT is the only market that I'm familiar with in the world that is energy only, which in the end, it ends up being kind of bare bones. People are not willing to put money into things that don't pay back. And we have this system, and it's worked for maybe 20 years.
Yeah.
And now that it hasn't worked, all the questions are coming out. But for 20 years, a lot of people have looked at it, and investors, and have wondered, you know, do I really want to make that investment? It looks risky. I don't get this guaranteed payment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a really great point, because we alluded to that in the blog post. But I mean, if you guys think about it in any other business situation, right? It's like someone saying, well, invest all this money into building something. I'll let you know when I need you. Good luck, right? And that's not very, like, how can you possibly plan around that? But I'm for just a clarification piece for anyone that's listening as well, Lafayette. So in the capacity payments, who pays the power plants?
So what would happen
for the standby payment? Yeah.
If you're in a marketplace, basically, in any other part of the United States, if you're in Louisiana, frankly, if you're in Beaumont, because Beaumont is not part of ERCOT, you get a monthly bill. And in the monthly bill, part of what you're paying for with your electricity is, it's called the rate base, and that all the components that go to support the grid, you have to pay for in your monthly bill. But the fact is it's not really clear how much savings Texas residential customers are getting. This is a separate part of the discussion that is in the paper. Is we in Texas are aware that all of us have choice. We get to choose our providers. Okay, and we haven't touched upon that. We've been really talking now about physically what happened in Texas. How did we run out of power? Well, it's a deregulated market and all this stuff. Well, ultimately, I think in this conversation, we have to look where we are as consumers, and the state tells us all that, well, at least you have the choice to pick your provider. And if you don't like your provider right now, you know, you're free to pick another provider. And
power to choose, right?
Power to choose. And this is what Michelle and I have spent a lot of time talking about, and frankly laughing about. I don't even know what I'm picking at times, okay? I don't know if I've done better by picking this company or that company. Is it green? Does it make me feel better? All I know is I really don't have a choice other than I have to choose. And they kind of promote this like it's a great value. Let's be real. What we would all choose is that the lights don't go out. You know, I wouldn't care whose name was on the envelope, as long, and it didn't matter who your provider was, by the way. If you were cut by the system operator, all of us, there are 40 different or however many providers in Houston, it didn't matter who your provider was. None was more reliable, because ultimately it's the wholesale grid that's providing that electricity through your middleman, that is the company you buy electricity from in the retail market. And so Michelle has used the analogy in the paper of a grocery store that basically is going out to buy things in the wholesale market, and you show up and pay a retail markup. It's the exact same thing for the power market.
So
do we as individuals do better? Well, I can tell you guaranteed who does better in this market is the large users. So the reason why Texas deregulated primarily is because large industry end users, big plants, can go out and pick their provider. And those big companies that use lots of electricity have people that work full time to lower those costs. It's energy management, okay, is a function in ERCOT that doesn't really exist in other markets. And so to large industrial users, and frankly, large commercial, like a shopping center, is in the wholesale market. And if they're an end user that uses a lot of electricity, maybe they have had savings. I just don't know that choice pushed all the way down to the guy in a one-bedroom apartment, that he's picking his retail provider if they are doing that much better. And this isn't a point of comparing the plans and stuff, but that's just what we have in Texas. They really don't have in New York. You don't sit in New York City and decide out of 20 companies which one is going to provide me the lowest
And then when you live in an apartment complex, you do it every year because you're moving and you're trying to find what's the new best rate, but ultimately you don't really understand what you're reading. So
I've never known if I've done that much better. So and please read if you haven't read the paper, because this is important, because we now sitting around scratching our heads are like, what have we been doing? What does this mean to me? How does this apply to my little house that went dark, or apartment that went dark and cold, and now my pipes burst? Is ultimately they push down onto us this deregulation that as consumers, it ends up being your choice, but you can't choose something more reliable than the system overall. And that system overall is not charging you for better reliability, which is what you pay for in other markets. And it doesn't mean their bills are double. I don't know exactly what the comparisons are, but they maintain a system that doesn't go cold. Look, it stays really cold in Chicago and New York and Detroit, and they manage cold weather systems. And we don't reward, or let's say there's not a revenue to the power companies in Texas to make those improvements. So they won't make that investment because they can't get a return on that investment in Texas. And those are market rules that are set by the legislation, not set by ERCOT. And so we're kind of now going back and forth a little bit. Please understand, when we say deregulation, there's a kind of a physical aspect of Texas, how many plants, how much generation, and things like that, all the way to then the kind of the business side of choice. And what does it mean to me as a consumer? And those are two separate rails, perhaps, but they both evolve from the market that we have in Texas. Okay.
Exactly. No, and I appreciate you outlining that, because a lot of the conversations that I've been having with folks, it's really more about, well, what happened to me in my home? But in order for us to understand really not just like how it happened, why it happened, what it means, we need to be able to, the reason I feel like we're focusing a lot and speaking a lot to the power generators, but ultimately that's where our power is coming from. So it's important to understand the source that is producing this. And then, as Lafayette mentioned, the structure of all of this is really important, because that's where we're going to find those opportunities for improvement, and especially in comparing it to how does it function in other states. That's extremely important. And so you touched a little bit on like pricing and all of that, Lafayette. One of the questions a lot of folks are asking as well is like, where are these massive electricity bills coming from, and how does that work? And is it truly because of this crazy situation that occurred last week, or is it something that was already put in place? And I think this goes back to the whole fixed variable rates with your electricity contracts, right?
It does in a way. I mean, there's kind of a sad, I mean, I've said this, maybe you've heard me say this, Michelle, but just before the lights go out, it gets really expensive. And think about that, that's economics. You know, is the price will go up and up and up, and then we run out. And then there's no power, but the last price paid was very high. And that's true for oil, that's true for natural gas. And so what happened last week across the United States is that the cold increased the need for energy everywhere. And the cold really impacted a lot of the regions that produce natural gas, and they weren't able to produce as much natural gas on a normal basis as they could or do, let's say. So the first thing that happened is the cost of fuel shot up over 100 times. Now, natural gas, as we normally price it, is something that's roughly $2 to $3 a unit, was trading at over $500 a unit in Chicago. And so it's simply a spike in need right when there was a shortage of physical availability. Now, the fact is that a lot of electricity comes from natural gas. Those natural gas plants have to buy the natural gas to run, and their cost of producing electricity from natural gas went up as that cost of fuel went up. So, by the way, when you're paying your power bills, just in general, there's a natural gas component in that power bill, because of the consumption of gas to make electricity. And so that impacted everyone across the country and their cost of energy. But if we now link, I think, Michelle, what you were talking about is, will my prices go up? How could I get a spike this month from last month? It's that, along with the choice, and let's call it the power to choose your provider, there's also a menu of options that the providers offer. You could do a 3-year deal that is kind of little variance month to month. In other words, they kind of annualize. And in Texas, that's so that in July and August, your air conditioned summer bill isn't way out of proportion to your winter bill that's normally lower. And so that's kind of a commercial product, as it were. It's no different than cell phone companies or other, business providers. They're different menu, just like mortgages could be variable on interest rates and things like that. It's the exact same thing the electric companies or retail providers are offering. And some people, I believe, are willing to say, look, in the summer, I'm going to be careful with my air conditioning, and I'd rather have the savings in the winter. So they are agreed to what would be, I guess, a flexible month to month, so that it varies some during the year, and they're exposed to higher air conditioning bills in the summer. Maybe they don't, maybe they have an efficient house or whatever. Or you could, again, do kind of an annualized smooth. And the people that are flexible probably weren't expecting high winter bills.
Yeah.
And as we know from the news, they're insane high bills that are now being pushed through to people that had variable rates. I have a feeling this is going to be a massive political issue, because let's be real, the most that someone probably was saving, let's say you have a $150, $200 a month bill, I have a feeling most consumers were thinking that maybe somewhere around $30 to $50 would be a swing value around what they could be exposed to or what their savings might be. I don't think any of them thought that on a bad month, by the way, you might get stuck with a $2,000 bill for something that's normally $150. That sounds like speculation that even more extreme than Vegas, right? And I hope and I expect that it won't be enough for the companies to say, well, buyer beware. The language was clear about what you were signing up for, because again, I don't think people can translate. I'm in the energy business. I have a background in electricity. And when I read these offerings and stuff, I don't really clearly understand some of what's there. And so I don't think buyer beware is going to work politically. And I know for a fact that the governor's already said that there's a moratorium on shutting things down, and who knows what's going to happen with that. But I also believe that in the end, and maybe this is kind of jumping to an end comment, but I really think that's what's going to change in ERCOT. I have a feeling that the retail market to residential customers is going to be restructured. Because I don't believe the history is going to show that we've had much savings incurred by the private sector and residential sector for deregulation. And the risks are now clear. And our money hasn't gone to pay for a reliable system. Again, if next month there was a new envelope and said, hey, pick me because we will be more reliable, I think everyone's going to jump to that new provider. Yeah. That's not what's in the offering until we change the rules in Austin. And I think that the wheels might be moving now towards that happening.
So that actually, sorry, go ahead.
But I hope that it moves that way, because I don't believe they're going to be able to show that over the last 20 years, residentials, I do believe that companies, large industrial users might have done well, but they're, this ought to be about power to the people, more as much as it is to say that, well, companies did well here, and the power companies do well here.
So, I love where you're going with this, and I think it leads really well to a couple of questions that have come up and that were submitted beforehand as well. Is in really thinking about in the way that the system is currently structured. Were there even opportunities right, to prevent this? And just thinking of the actual way that the system is structured right now, yes or no? And then if not, right, so then what does the system need to look like in order to prevent this in the future? Is it in the working towards having more interconnections to the other two grids in the United States, or is it opportunity to, does ERCOT remain and restructure, or is it that we should disband and, you know, mimic more of what's happening across the country?
Right. So real importantly, which is covered in the paper and we didn't mention, is that ERCOT, as an independent system with the other grids, Western and Eastern around us, and there are other ISOs within those grids, are about 8 independent system operators. The East Coast has several ISOs that are separate, but they're connected, so that when New York really needs power, they can rely on what's next to them in Pennsylvania. And because those ISOs are interconnected, they work together to coordinate and help out in these events. The Texas independent system is not connected. There was no way the power which was available in New Mexico and Colorado and Louisiana, we're not connected, we're an island. And that was by choosing of the Texas legislation. We could have an independent system operator that still is a little bit more connected to the other parts of the grid that would have helped us. It might not have stopped all of this, but the lack of interconnection means there was no way for our neighbors to help us in the middle of the system in this problem. So that is a physical thing, much like the generation. The other part is, as I mentioned, ERCOT did the best they could with what they had available to them at the time. That is a system that wasn't winterized, that the pipelines and the plants did not have the systems available to keep warm, to keep operating. And there's a bizarre type of technology. Okay, so in the middle of summer, when it's really, really hot, power plants aren't efficient because the air is hot that goes into them. And the and the car analogy works well. If you can inject cold air into your car engine, it will run faster. So gas-fired plants in Texas do something called air inlet cooling. They put refrigerators on the front of power plants in Texas to cool the air so that the power plant is more efficient and makes more power. That's not regulated. They make more money because when they run, they're more efficient and they get paid back in their energy payment. It's not a regulation thing. It's like, I want my car to go faster, so I'm juicing up my car, and it performs better as an investment. The flip side of that, if they were to put heaters on the front of their power plants so they did not freeze up, they were just making power, they wouldn't get paid back for that necessarily. Now, they do realize now that if they're not running, they don't make any money. But no one winterized their plants because on most systems, they said, yeah, I've done well without it. Why spend money to do things that I'm not sure I'm going to get my money back? Whereas when they put those air conditioners on the front of the plants, they get their money back. And so that's a bit of the system wide. We need to winterize. ERCOT was advised to do that. ERCOT could not mandate. There was no penalty. There was no real way to make the generators do that other than, hey, we think it'd be a good idea. And then they said, nah, I'm not going to do that. It's like telling your child that homework is optional. They're probably not going to do it. They're probably better analogies, but.
But could people have put more pressure on, like if we would have known this information, I mean, it was probably out there, right? But no one was looking for it because no one was experiencing massive power outages. But if we would have known this information, could we have put more pressure on ERCOT to put more pressure on the power plants, and then getting the people involved, would that have like made changes?
How many people knew what ERCOT was until last week? I mean, let's be honest. You might not have even known that CenterPoint wasn't responsible for generation. You see CenterPoint and their names involved. I got a separate provider. What does CenterPoint do? I mean, the fact is the market is very complicated, and they want the system. You know, as long as the lights stay on, literally politicians keep their jobs and no one's going to worry about it. It's when the lights go out that everyone asks questions. And now here we are, the lights went out and there's severe consequences. And look, the economic consequences of it is that it could change our homeowners insurance policies.
Yeah.
So the fact that our utilities failed and our pipes froze and we had water damage, not only are you stuck with a bill for that repair that wouldn't have happened if your property didn't freeze, not entirely because pipes freeze in the cold, but if your house did not go 3 days below freezing, there's a good chance that a lot of this water damage wouldn't have occurred. So now the insurance company's got to step up in billions of dollars of bailout, and then they're going to change the insurance rates and all this stuff. And I go back to, did we as residential consumers in Texas do better over the last 20 years by having the power to choose? And I think that ERCOT, you asked, what happens next? How do we fix this? I think that there's going to be a massive federal demand and state demand for more interconnection. So Texas is going to connect to Louisiana, Arkansas, and Colorado, regardless of how the regulations change. So physical connectivity. It's going to take a while and it's expensive. Then the market rules, how will those change? Going from deregulated market, what level of regulation will be introduced that will fix this? I'm not sure, because it's kind of like a model. And is the model going to have to be broken before they repair it, or are there line items of adjustments that would be in place? My concern is that all of a sudden they say, well, now we need to winterize. Too bad we didn't do it for the last 20 years, but over the next 2 years, you all have to pay for it now. And then all of us see our rates go up for something that frankly, maybe we should have been paying a little bit for 20 years. A, that we kept the lights on, and B, is not a sudden spike in our rates that maybe we could expect some costs coming through now to winterize things and fix the system again, that I believe should have perhaps been tended to over a period of time. And Michelle, one of the conversations you and I have, I've been in my house for 20 years. I pay X every month. I added that up. Over 20 years, I've paid, even for my little house, an arm and a leg, I believe, towards keeping the lights on. And I thought that some of that was to go to create a resistant system or reliable system.
Yeah.
You're not just paying a monthly bill with water under the bridge. Part of what you're paying for is the system overall and the system integrity overall. And now everyone's like, how much integrity is there in our system? And wasn't I paying for that? So again, I'm not sure then when we go back to fixing ERCOT, is this that we throw the model out? Do we start over again? I'm not sure what how this works.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the answer right now, and it kind of alludes to something that Gilbert put in the chat as well. But the reason why, when we did the write-up, we kept it as objective, as unbiased as possible, is because in order for us to look for solutions, we need to understand what all the pieces are and how they function today, and then compare it against what parts of the system failed, which we've kind of talked about today, and then making decisions about either do we need to then just fix these components, or do we need to redo the whole thing? But in order to do that, you kind of had to do this bottom-up approach, in my opinion, of like what comes next, and that itself could take some iterations. I'm always like, because I have a supply chain brain too, I always like to think about things in that way. Versus just like jumping to conclusions in a way. But one thing I did want us to touch on, Lafayette, before we're out of time, is that there was this whole conversation, again, probably because of the gap in information around the fuel sources that were used to generate our power in Texas, and combined with as well, earlier we're talking about ERCOT. The way that ERCOT balances supply and demand is by forecasting or estimating what this demand will be. So combining the notion of like the fuel sources that are currently in place, therefore like the infrastructure that's currently in place and everything that needs to be there, and then looking at the forecast, the methodology for the forecast that ERCOT has been putting into place, and then trying to add that layer that a lot of people are starting to ask the question of, is how does climate change really play a role into how the frequency of these events that people keep saying, the 100-year flood, et cetera, how does the methodology for forecasting our demand and balancing that supply and demand need to be adjusted, or should be adjusted based on the climate conversation as well? Is that a factor?
Well, I think sitting in Houston, you know, in the last 15 years, I don't know the specifics, but all of us have experienced, you know, what were considered 100-year storms. How many have we had in the last 10 years? And we don't want to hear, oh, woe is us. Who could have known it was a 100-year storm? Therefore, X, Y, and Z broke in the city. You know, is it now we realize, look, these storms are coming. This is our, I don't want to say it's our new normal, but what I look at is climate, what I consider is climate volatility. We're going to have these more extreme swings. That summers might only be, August might only be getting hotter for us, requiring more air conditioning, besides the fact that more and more people are moving here, but just hotter on and more extreme patterns of weather, and including hurricane or winter events. And so I'll be honest with you that when I hear people say, oh, who could have known this is a 1 in 100-year storm? Trust me, the people that do statistics and do analysis of fatal flaws in systems, that's what you need to protect against, is that unlikely event. Because otherwise, if we're 4 minutes away from a system that, from a storm system that could put us out of power for 8 weeks, and they say, oh, well, who could have known it was a 100-year storm? That's unacceptable. And again, it's unfortunate, but the issue with weather and climate change is that we should expect to have swings and the pace of change to be rather extreme. I mean, here we are now running air conditionings in Houston, what, a week later? You know, and we're heading into spring, and it just those extremes. Texas has always had extremes, and never have I experienced something that cold for, you know, living here for a long time. But again, it doesn't mean it can't happen. Obviously, it did happen. We're obviously not going to experience Chicago winters in the length, but Chicago's getting really hot in the summer, and at times getting even colder. Maybe, I don't know if it's getting colder there, but you know, I'm saying that the weather patterns, it's not enough for people to say, oh, it's out of our control, because the statistics are going to show that these hurricane events are becoming more extreme, and we need to look at how people are, you know, unfortunately, a lot of the impact is due to maybe poor building and other issues, that the cost and the impact to us is residents here aren't just the weather. It's that, are we building residual homes, systems, infrastructure, planning and flooding? You know, that's the big discussion in Houston, is if we've got so much concrete here now that the flooding is just is what we have to live with, or are there things that we can do? So that falls into a much bigger discussion of planning and zoning and all this other stuff. But I do believe that, you know, our power grid has to be resistant to and able to operate under. We were not close to having enough power in February for this event. Yeah. Not even close. And so that's where we're starting from here, is that it's not that one location, the whole market had an impact.
Yeah, and then also to add, and I love that Gilberto just brought this up in the chat, because I was chatting with some folks about this on Twitter as well, because my former role involved me also looking into the market in Mexico, and the way that we chose to structure our market in Texas, and the interconnections that we chose to also then set up contracts and everything else with our neighboring country in Mexico. We also impacted their markets during that last week, especially northern Mexico. And I have family in Mexico as well that suffered a lot of the outages as a result of the way that the structure was set in place with Texas. So that's also something that folks aren't talking about. So thank you for bringing that up in the chat. What should we?
I'd like to make one comment on renewable energy, because we're talking about resources and the choice of fuel supply, and some comments by politicians, I think, that are misplaced. Renewable energy is in fact a huge success in Texas, and it started being developed about 20 years ago. Texas has more renewable wind resource development than countries like Germany, and it's a remarkable success. that success is really measured in Texas by the investors. I think more important than we as consumers benefiting from it, although we get low cost power truly by wind, the success factor for renewables in Texas is really based upon investors being able to develop them, get them operating, get their money out of them. And that's not a bad thing, but they're not winterized. You know, they have wind farms in Norway and Sweden and northern parts of the United States that don't freeze up. And our system did freeze up. But again, it falls back to the investors or get their money out on kind of bread and butter, installing a wind farm, not worrying about dressing it up for winter. They make their money in the summer. And so I hope that in the political crosshairs, renewables are at times a linchpin and pointed to either good or bad. And Texas has a remarkable history. Some of the wind farms now are actually at their end of life, because these kind of plants don't really operate at times much more than 20, 25 years. Now they might just go change the blades or the parts of it and be new again. But again, a 20-year plant is a long time that these have been operating in some parts of the state. And I want it to be recognized that it's a success story, but that success is really in a business context, and how they then through the regulation maybe make people winterize their renewables or something like that. I don't know. But I hope that renewable energy is not viewed as a linchpin on either side of the spectrum of politics and whatnot. It's a fact of our market. It produces a lot of important energy on summer days, especially in West Texas. Just an amazing amount of capacity is there. And so, and it's low cost. Once it's built, all it takes is the wind. You don't have to buy natural gas or coal or something else. There's no cost of fuel. So it's kind of like we need a mix of things so that on a cold day, we're still covered. And it's part of the mix on a summer day, and maybe it could be part of the mix on a winter day. But again, I think that's important because a lot of people are looking at this as their careers. Renewable is going to be high growth, a lot of investment, a lot of focus, and that's a good thing. And I hope that the backdrop of Texas being a success for renewable energy is not lost in this discussion.
Thank you so much, Lafayette. We really appreciate you sharing your insight. And with that, we're actually out of time, folks. Thank you so much for joining the conversation, for providing your feedback and your commentary. And again, Lafayette, thank you so much for taking my call. We literally started working through this, I think, on Friday, turned into the blog being posted on Monday, and then next thing you know, we're having this conversation. So thank you for making the time. And thank you everyone else for joining today.